I will start throwing questions at you. There's quite a few after coming in. We'll start with a general one from Oliver Walsh. Is it sensible to be approving planning permission for the data centres that are being proposed at the moment? They're highly electrically intensive facilities, putting additional pressure on the grid to meet the demand with very little return in terms of sustainable jobs.
Yeah, really good point. You know, and there's two ways of looking at that. You can look at as data centers as a burden on the system, but I also think there's a huge opportunity within data centers in Ireland. But we need to get that right, and they do need to, I think, play a more active role in decarbonisation. One of the challenges around, like, there's good and there's bad. One of the challenges around decarbonisation of data centers is the idea of synthetic offsetting, and if you look at the RESE targets that we have at the moment, and if you look at the climate action plan, the real jump in ambition from the old 55% renewable electricity target that we have up to 70% is because of those data centers, because they're funding these green projects. And when you stand back and look at the old numbers, that actually ends up with a net reduction of our emissions. No, but a net reduction isn't good enough. One thing that I kind of take a lot of hope from, and we've had a lot of conversations in UCC with different data center providers. But if you look at the companies like Microsoft and the Googles, they have net zero visions for 2030. So my hope is, and I think it's a very valid point that we're making around data centers, that they'll be kind of dragged into this decarbonisation journey and hopefully up their game from just synthetic offsetting, which is a good start. But we need to go better than that. You know, if you're just buying 70% of our electricity will be clean renewables in the year 2030. That means that 30% won't be. So, you know, Facebook doesn't shut down when the wind isn't blowing. We need to ensure that we can encourage those companies to have on-site storage, to be flexible, look at grid services. If we don't get that right, I think there's a reputational risk to those companies and to Ireland as a whole.
Yeah, very good. Borgosh Energy, for interconnector imports, do you take the average CO2 intensity from the country we're importing from to contribute to the overall value, e.g. France versus UK?
No, it's zero. So the all electricity imports into a country are assumed to be zero. So it's the emissions rest with the country where it's generated.
Okay. Okay, next one is, how do you see the role of green hydrogen in achieving the targets?
Yeah, at the end of this report, and I suppose, Bernice, we didn't have enough time to go into today, but at the end of the report, there's a couple of sections on beyond 2030 and looking at different futures. And one of the things that we looked at two specific technologies. We looked at hydrogen, we looked at green hydrogen, and said, well, you know, even in 2030, what could we do if there's a certain level of wind curtailment in 2030? Let's just say there's 7% wind curtailment. What could we do with that in terms of transforming it to green hydrogen? And one of the things that we found out, we tended to communicate those numbers in terms of trucks and buses. So one of the tricky things I find from a public engagement perspective around hydrogen is that we talk about, you know, in kgs or in meter squared, but bringing it down to widgets of budgets or of buses or trucks is a helpful role. So if we look at the 2030 figures, I think we come up with a value of there's enough potential there to generate green hydrogen to power a kind of a pretty large bus fleet, something like a 1,000 or so buses. But the thing about green hydrogen, you know, we've talked about it for so often. You know, even I remember when I was back doing my PhD, you know, we're still talking about green hydrogen at even back then. So I think we need to move on from the talking and start to do, you know, get some pilot projects off the ground. Even in Marai, you know, looking at my colleagues Rory Monaghan, James Carton, and others, they're doing incredible work about trying to get these pilot phases up off the ground. So I'm very hopeful for a green hydrogen. I don't think it's a silver bullet that many of us are expecting. I think it will play a very important role, particularly in the areas that we can't, that are too tricky to electrify or too expensive to electrify.
And maybe people might be interested, we'll run a more detailed seminar on hydrogen in the Irish context in March time, so we'll get the details of that out as soon as possible, so it might be of interest to people. Michael O'Mahony, 70% curtailment of renewables in 2030, would have expected higher. What other solutions to curtailment are you assuming are happening in 2030?
Okay, sorry, Bernice, I didn't quite. So the level of curtailment that we expect to see in 2030 for that system is about 7%.
Sorry, did I say 70? I should have said 70.
Yeah, I almost fell off my chair.
Sorry.
Yeah, he's got it, won't be so. So, and Michael's question was, why isn't it higher, or why isn't it lower?
He would have expected higher. So just wondering if there's other solutions to curtailment that you're assuming in there.
Yeah, really good question, Michael, and hello, Michael. One of the things that we did in that report was that we really drove flexibility within the system. So for all those EVs, for example, for all those heat pumps, we assumed that about 20% of that load would be flexible. And this starts to play a really fundamentally important role in moving the demand around to match that supply. We did some sensitivities, Michael, in the report about looking at what would happen if that flexibility wasn't available, what is the implication in terms of CO2 emissions. So there's a number of things happen there that allow us to keep our level of curtailment relatively low. Now, many people, Bernice, would argue that 7% is too high, but this is kind of the things that we did. We looked at everything from interconnection. We've got demand side units. We've got smart metering on EVs. We've got smart metering on our on the heat pumps, and also we've got we really stressed the conventional units, dropping down to min stable levels. Pushing their ramp rate. So it's really a kind of a collection of all those things that come together to kind of hold that figure at about 7%.
Very good. Okay, next up, Kevin O'Rourke has 3 questions for you. So number 1, how does 30% overall RE by 2030 align with the government target, the 7% per annum reductions? Number 2, what does that mean if we only have modest reductions in agriculture and or transport and freight emissions? And number 3, worth pointing out, the treatment of wind in your Sankey diagram should show no losses, whereas CCGT will have 45% losses. This is relevant because the 70% RESI target relates to outputs, not inputs.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I just on the losses, first of all, please forgive me. They're actually kind of tricky to draw, and you're right. But what the losses show is I understand where you're coming. The losses are actually at the bottom, aren't they? But the losses are actually from the system, from the electricity system itself. It's not meant to represent the losses directly from the wind system. I know what you're saying now, because the wind is coming in one side and the losses are coming.
It looks like it's directly linked, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So our losses are about 46% in the system today, and a bit lower in the future. But thanks, Kevin. We will work on that. In terms of the 30% ambition for renewable energy that I spoke, Kevin, that actually comes from the National Energy Climate Action Plan that we submitted to Brussels last summer. That's where I took that figure from. Now, there's a couple of interesting notes within that report. Number 1, it's presented as kind of a living document. It's saying, look, our ambition based on the best knowledge that we have at the moment is I think it's about 32% renewable energy for 2030. There's a strong caveat with that around the change of government. Of course, the National Climate Energy Action Plan was just submitted to Europe just after the new government was formed. So we'd expect to see some revisions for that plan, and hopefully those revisions will go up. But the official statement at the moment, the official position at the moment, Kevin, is at 30% or 32% figure, which comes from the National Climate and Energy Action Plan. And in agriculture, great point in agriculture. We didn't touch on it too much in the report, but really, it's there's a fundamental truth in kind of a lot of these modeling exercises. The less we do in agriculture, the less we do in changing behavior, the less we do in transport, the less we do in heating, the more we will have to do with electricity. And if you look at, even at the Climate Change Committee over in the UK at the moment, they released their 6 carbon budget just this week. They're looking actually at the electricity system in the UK going negative from about 2032 onwards, with things like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage coming in 2027. And again, those negative emissions technologies, Kevin, are to pick up those residual emissions from the areas that either are a bit too slow to decarbonize, or too tricky, or too expensive to decarbonize.
Very good. Okay, so we've got piles of questions. I don't know if we're going to get through them all, but we'll try and get through a few more. Stephen Cole, has waste to energy been considered to reduce CO2?
Yes, yeah. So what we have, Stephen, in the report, we've taken the current capacity for the 2 waste to energy plants in Ireland, and they're assumed to just stay there out to 2030. And it is the 50% of that is allowed to contribute towards the RESI target, and so it's assumed to be biodegradable. And we've an emissions coefficient in there as well. I can't remember what we use, but the emissions are accounted for it as well.
Okay. Donald Kassan asks, how will we incentivize the 2.5 gigawatts of gas-fired gen we need to back up the intermittent wind with low operating hours in 2030? Do you model green H2 bio CH4 blended with CH4 and gas-fired power generators? GNI and gas TSOs throughout the EU are looking at 20% green H2 blends, and this would reduce CO2 emissions significantly.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Yeah, look, stepping back from this, one of the, when you read this report, you're kind of left with questions, well, how are we going to incentivize all this? We need more gas-fired generation. We need to spend, it's going to operate in an environment that's much more demanding, cycling a lot more, being too shifted a lot more, coming under a lot of physical pressure within the system, and also maybe making a lot less money. So the area that we didn't look at is the markets, and that is an important area, because I think we kind of bit off enough that we could chew within the study, looking at the system that was there. And we didn't look at blending of H2 within the system. We didn't look at blending of biogas within the system. But that's something that, of course, would have an emissions benefit, but wasn't considered in the study.
Okay. Yeah, phase 2 maybe. So Barry McMullen, can you comment further on the issue of upstream emissions, both CH4 and CH2, even if CCS is deployed on natural gas-fired generation? Also, did your model account for possible migration from CCGT to OCGT with or without CCS as capacity factors fall?
Hi, Barry, and great question, Barry. So the figures that you see there for the CCS, Barry, don't consider those upstream emissions. And you're completely right. We need to, if we're looking at something like CCS, not just consider the emissions within Ireland, but also those upstream emissions. And when we're doing the report, we looked at information from the Climate Change Advisory Council in the UK. So if you have a CCGT and it's operating at an 80% capture rate, you're generating electricity at about 80 grams per kilowatt hour. That's pretty good. Now, if you consider it's upstream emissions, and it very much depends here, Barry, on where you're getting that gas from. If it's coming from pipeline gas from Norway, it would have a relatively low emissions profile. There's really good practice in terms of regulation, strong regulation in the North Sea. And of course, very different emissions profile than if you're getting it somewhere like the USA, or if you're getting it somewhere from North Africa. So the figures that we have at the moment, Barry, we kind of lean a lot on the IEA emissions tracker. So the upstream emissions could be anything from, if it's coming from a country where it's well regulated and pipeline gas, the extra incremental addition would be about 15 grams per kilowatt hour, and then an extra 80 grams per kilowatt hour if you're coming from a poorly regulated country, unconventional gas. So really, when you're talking about CCS, as you said, it's not only good enough to consider about the emissions at the plant itself, to step back and look at the broader picture and look at the wider emissions. And within the report itself, do we consider the migration of OCGTs or CCGTs to CCS? No, Barry, we didn't. We kind of just did this as a kind of a thought experiment. We just dropped one new CCGT plant into the system and just kind of put some numbers with, I think it's about 1 million tons. We didn't do anything around costs. Obviously, the retrofitting costs might be lower if you're coming from an existing plant, but the costs, of course, around CCS are uncertain.
Okay. I'm going to skip the next one, hydrogen, because we've already covered it. And a couple of people have asked about nuclear. How is nuclear viewed?
Yeah. Nuclear always comes up, and that's a good thing. I'm a fan of all areas of decarbonisation. We didn't look at it in the study. Now, let me just be honest here. The EAI gave us complete scope. They didn't influence in any way. But myself and Laura, particularly myself, felt that if you start to put something like nuclear into a report like this, it just dominates the whole conversation. And there's some really important things coming out of this report around conventional generation, around emissions, around emission budgets, around different options. And we felt that putting nuclear in there would just kind of dominate the whole discussion. So we decided to leave it out. It's my own personal views. Some of my colleagues and my friends don't share a lot of these views, but I think we should need to consider all decarbonisation options. Now, whether it's suitable for Ireland or not is a big question. If you're looking at these, I think large nuclear power stations, I think don't really make a lot of sense in an economy the size of Ireland. So really, you'd be looking to the smaller modular type. But of course, the difficulty there is that the commercial availability is highly uncertain. There's a very good report released last month. I think it's called 18 for Zero, that talks about these questions, looking at the next decade. One thing I will say about nuclear energy and small nuclear reactors, it is uncertain, but it doesn't mean we should stop doing what we're doing today. We really don't have time on our side. We need to continue energy efficiency, continue the build out of renewables, continue the electrification. And in 10, 15 years' time, if there is new technologies available, we should consider those, but it cannot be an excuse for not doing what we're doing at the moment.
Okay. Another one from Michael O'Mahony. So if we generate very high VRE and have high exports, the marginal price will be very low, if not negative. This means we'd be paying other countries to take our renewable electricity at the Irish consumers' PSO price would increase significantly. Do we need other ways of managing this? We're getting into markets again, I suppose, but yeah, do you want to have a quick comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Look, and we didn't study markets, but I think, when you step back and look at Europe, look at Ireland, look at the UK, it's quite clear, that the markets need to change. The power system is changing. The way we produce power, the way we produce electricity is changing. Our markets will need to evolve with that as well. The current markets are on sharper marginal cost. They weren't based on these kind of systems. So I think there will either be gradual transitions to different markets or abrupt changes, and which one would happen, I'm not really sure. But I think there is recognition that not only our markets, but our institutions need to change, our policies need to change, our own behavior needs to change if we want this future.
And maybe one last one, a couple along the same lines of what do you think in terms of microgrid and small scale electricity and heat generation will play in future zero carbon policy?
Yeah, we need everything. To be honest, Bernice, and you do a lot of this modeling as well. I've never seen something that you wouldn't need in terms of decarbonisation. I think one of the challenges that we have in Ireland that we tend to focus on our pet technologies that we like, and we tend to discount everything else. But we need everything. You need to throw the kitchen sink at this thing, and then you need to throw everything else after it. We need interconnections, microgeneration, energy efficiency. We need bioenergy. We probably need negative emissions technologies. We need everything. And of course, the challenge then is understanding what is the best mix of all those technologies coming together. One of the things, again, that I was surprised in this report when we were doing the modeling was the role of solar. I would have written off solar years ago. As an expensive technology that doesn't really help us that much in Ireland, but we see it actually really kind of not huge levels of solar, but having a modest, helpful implication for the grid here in Ireland. So we kind of need everything, and I think that's really important.
Great. Listen, we've got actually quite a few more questions. I just don't think we're going to get to them. We're out of time. But what we might do, Sinead, is take those and ask Paul if he might look through the remaining questions, and we'll circulate some responses to those after the presentation.
Sure.
So listen, that was a fantastic hour, whistle stop tour. I think lots of people are going away now to dive into this report if they haven't done already, because there's so much detail in it and so much work into it. So well done to you and all your team there, and Laura and everyone else who's involved in it. Thanks for giving us your time this evening, Paul. And I think it's the start of a really good conversation, plenty of interaction here. Everyone is saying well done, super presentation. Hopefully you can see all those comments. As I always say, it's a shame not to be able to get a proper round of applause after something like this on the webinars. It's one of the drawbacks, but I think you'll see that everyone has really appreciated it. So thank you for your time.